In late 1942, as the war in North Africa entered a new phase, German soldiers of the Africa Corps began hearing reports about a new enemy arriving on the battlefield. Until then, they had faced mostly British and Commonwealth forces, experienced, disciplined, and predictable in their methods. The British fought carefully, often relying on set-piece battles, artillery preparation, and cautious advances. German officers understood their patterns. They respected them, but they also knew how to counter them. The Americans, however, were an unknown. When Operation Torch began in November 1942, thousands of American troops landed in North Africa. At first, many German soldiers did not take them seriously. To them, the Americans were inexperienced, recently trained, and untested in real combat. Some German veterans even joked that the Americans were tourists in uniform, but that perception would not last long. The first real encounters between German and American forces revealed something unexpected. In early clashes, especially during the Tunisian campaign, American units sometimes made serious mistakes. They advanced without proper coordination, exposed their positions, and underestimated German defenses. For seasoned German troops, this confirmed their initial belief: the Americans lacked experience. But then, something changed. Despite early setbacks, the Americans did not behave the way the Germans expected. Instead of slowing down or becoming overly cautious, they adapted quickly. They learned from their mistakes at a speed that surprised even experienced German commanders. Within weeks, their tactics began to evolve. Their coordination improved, their use of combined arms became more effective, and their confidence grew. One of the most striking differences was how the Americans approached combat at the individual and small unit level. German soldiers were trained to follow strict orders and operate within a disciplined structure. British troops, too, emphasized coordination and planning, but American soldiers often showed a different kind of behavior, more aggressive, more flexible, and sometimes even unpredictable. German reports from the front began to mention this. They described American troops who would continue attacking even after taking heavy losses, who would attempt flanking maneuvers without waiting for perfect orders, and who seemed willing to take risks that others avoided. To the Germans, this was both surprising and unsettling. There were moments when American units made bold, almost reckless advances. In some cases, these actions led to failure, but in others, they caught German forces off guard. Positions that were expected to hold suddenly came under pressure from unexpected directions. Patrols that should have been routine turned into intense firefights. German soldiers began to realize that the Americans were not simply inexperienced, they were different. Another factor quickly became impossible to ignore: the sheer volume of American firepower. Even in these early encounters, American units made heavy use of artillery and air support. German troops found themselves facing sudden and overwhelming bombardments. Positions that might have been held against British attacks were now subjected to relentless shelling and airstrikes before any ground assault even began. This created a new kind of battlefield experience. It was no longer just about maneuver and tactics. It was about endurance under constant pressure. German soldiers started to understand that fighting the Americans would not be the same as fighting the British. By early 1943, after battles such as Kasserine Pass, German commanders had formed a more balanced view. The Americans had shown weaknesses, yes, but they had also shown something else: the ability to improve rapidly, to fight aggressively, and to bring overwhelming resources to the battlefield. For many German soldiers, the first encounters with American forces marked the beginning of a shift in perception. The inexperienced newcomers were quickly becoming a serious threat. They were not bound by the same patterns. They did not always fight the way they were expected to. And in war, Unpredictability can be one of the most dangerous qualities of all. What began as curiosity soon turned to caution, and for some, it would eventually turn to respect and even fear. By 1943, German soldiers on multiple fronts had begun to notice a clear and unsettling pattern whenever they faced American forces. It was not just the aggression or unpredictability they had seen earlier, it was something far more overwhelming. The Americans did not simply fight battles, they reshaped them with firepower. For German troops who had spent years fighting in Europe and North Africa, warfare had always been a balance of movement, timing, and precision. Success often depended on coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery, executed with discipline and efficiency. Even under heavy pressure, there was a sense that battles could be influenced through skillful maneuver. But when the Americans entered the fight in full force, that balance began to disappear. One of the earliest signs came from the increasing use of artillery. German soldiers were accustomed to artillery support from their enemies, but the scale and intensity of American bombardments felt different. It was not just preparation for an attack, it was continuous, methodical, and often overwhelming. In Tunisia and later in Italy, German positions were frequently subjected to prolonged shelling before any ground movement began. Entire hillsides would erupt under concentrated fire. Trenches collapsed, communication lines were cut, and units were forced to stay under cover for hours at a time. Even experienced soldiers found it difficult to maintain cohesion under such pressure. What made it more dangerous was the accuracy. American forward observers, often positioned dangerously close to the front lines, worked with artillery units to adjust fire in real time. If a German unit tried to reposition or counterattack, it could quickly find itself targeted again within minutes. Then there was the air power. German veterans had faced air attacks before, especially from the British Royal Air Force. But by 1943 and 1944, American air superiority began to dominate entire regions. Fighter bombers roamed the skies, attacking supply lines, vehicles, and even small troop movements. For German soldiers on the ground, this created a constant sense of exposure. Moving during daylight became increasingly dangerous. Columns of reinforcements or supplies risked being spotted and destroyed before they reached their destination. Even behind the front lines, there was no real sense of safety. Some German accounts describe the psychological effect of this constant threat. The sound of approaching aircraft was enough to send soldiers diving for cover. Roads became death traps. Open terrain turned into a liability rather than an advantage. But the true shock came when artillery and air power were combined. During Allied offensives in Italy and later in Western Europe, American forces often coordinated massive bombardments with ground assaults. First came the artillery, softening defenses and disrupting communication. Then came waves of aircraft, striking deeper targets and preventing reinforcements. And finally, infantry and armored units advanced into positions that had already been heavily damaged. For German defenders, this sequence created a sense of inevitability. It was not just a battle, it felt like being systematically dismantled. There were moments when German units held their ground with remarkable determination. Defensive positions in Italy, especially along fortified lines, sometimes resisted repeated attacks. But even in those cases, the cost of holding those positions increased dramatically. Supplies ran low, casualties mounted, and the ability to respond weakened over time. What frustrated many German officers was that traditional countermeasures seemed less effective. Skilled maneuver, surprise attacks, and tactical positioning, methods that worked against other enemies, were harder to apply when facing overwhelming firepower. Even a well-planned counterattack could be stopped by sudden artillery strikes or air intervention.
Some German commanders began to describe the American way of war as Materialschlacht, a battle of material. It was a war fought not just with soldiers, but with machines, ammunition, and industrial strength on a scale that Germany struggled to match. And yet, it was not simply about quantity. American forces demonstrated an ability to coordinate these resources effectively. Communication systems, logistics, and planning allowed them to maintain pressure without losing momentum. When one attack stalled, another could be prepared quickly. When resistance was encountered, it could be met with even greater firepower. For the German soldier on the front line, this created a new kind of reality. The battlefield was no longer defined by moments of intense combat, followed by periods of relative calm. Instead, it became a continuous experience of pressure, where danger could come at any time, from the sky, from distant artillery, or from advancing units supported by both. By the time the war reached Western Europe in 1944, this pattern had become unmistakable. The Americans did not rely on finesse alone. They did not depend solely on perfect execution or elegant tactics. They brought overwhelming force to bear again and again until resistance began to crack. And for many German soldiers, this was what made them truly dangerous. It was not just how they fought, but how much they could bring to the fight and how relentlessly they were willing to use it.
By the time the war moved deeper into Italy and later into Western Europe, German soldiers had already learned to expect overwhelming American firepower. But there was another factor that proved just as dangerous, something less predictable and harder to counter. It was the way American soldiers fought once the battle reached close range. German doctrine emphasized discipline, structure, and control. Orders moved down the chain of command, and units were expected to act in coordination. Initiative existed, but it was shaped within a clear system. British forces, too, often followed careful planning, relying on set operations and coordinated advances. American soldiers, however, began to show a different pattern, especially in the chaos of frontline combat. After the early lessons in North Africa, American units adapted quickly. By the time of the Sicilian campaign in 1943 and the Italian campaign that followed, German troops were encountering an enemy that no longer hesitated as before. Instead, American infantry often pushed forward aggressively, even in difficult terrain and under heavy fire. One of the key differences was how small units operated. Squad leaders, sergeants, and even individual soldiers were more willing to make decisions on their own. If a position needed to be taken, they did not always wait for perfect coordination. They acted. German reports from Italy describe repeated instances where American patrols advanced into contested areas with surprising boldness. Instead of probing cautiously and withdrawing, they pressed forward, sometimes turning reconnaissance missions into sudden assaults. This created confusion among German defenders who expected a more measured approach. There were moments when this aggression seemed almost reckless. American soldiers would charge machine gun positions, attempt flanking maneuvers through exposed ground, or continue advancing despite heavy casualties. To a German observer, this behavior could appear undisciplined. But it was precisely this willingness to act, to seize the moment, that made it dangerous. In the mountains and hills of Italy, where terrain often limited visibility and communication, battles frequently broke down into small, intense engagements. In these conditions, rigid command structures became harder to maintain, and this is where American initiative began to stand out. If a German position was discovered, American units did not always wait for artillery or reinforcements. They improvised. Smoke grenades, coordinated rushes, and quick flanking movements were used to disrupt defenses. Even when initial attacks failed, follow-up attempts often came quickly, giving defenders little time to recover.
German soldiers began to notice that once Americans gained momentum, they were difficult to stop. They did not easily give up ground. If pushed back, they reorganized and attacked again. This persistence created a constant pressure at the front lines. A similar pattern appeared during the Normandy campaign in 1944. After the landings, American forces faced heavily fortified German positions, especially in the Bocage countryside, dense hedgerows that turned the landscape into a natural maze of defensive strongpoints. German units initially believed these conditions would favor their defensive tactics, and in many cases they did. The hedgerows allowed for hidden machine gun nests, ambushes, and well-protected positions. But once again, the Americans adapted. Instead of relying solely on large-scale coordination, small units began to develop their own methods. Tanks were modified to break through hedgerows. Infantry squads learned to work closely with armor, moving from one position to another with speed and aggression. When a gap was found, they exploited it immediately. German defenders found themselves facing sudden breakthroughs in areas they believed were secure. Positions that had held for days could be lost within hours once American units identified a weakness. There were also countless individual acts of initiative that left a strong impression. Soldiers who advanced under fire to silence machine guns, small groups that held positions against counterattacks, and patrols that pushed deeper into enemy lines than expected. These actions were not always part of a larger plan, but they often had a significant impact on the battle. To German troops, this created a sense of unpredictability at a very personal level. It was no longer just about facing an organized force, it was about facing individuals and small units willing to take risks and act decisively in the moment. Some German accounts describe Americans as less refined in their tactics compared to European armies, but more direct and forceful. They did not always execute textbook maneuvers, but they compensated with speed, determination, and a refusal to remain passive. Over time, this combination of aggression and initiative began to reshape German perceptions. The Americans were no longer seen as inexperienced or simply reliant on firepower. They had developed a fighting style that was difficult to predict and even harder to contain once it gained momentum. In close combat, where decisions had to be made in seconds and opportunities appeared and disappeared quickly, this approach gave them a clear advantage. And for the German soldier facing them across a narrow field, a hedgerow, or a ruined village street, that unpredictability could be as dangerous as any artillery barrage. Because in those moments, the battle was no longer controlled by plans or orders. It was decided by whoever acted first and acted with the most determination.
By 1944, as the war shifted decisively into Western Europe, German soldiers were facing a reality that went beyond firepower and battlefield aggression. It was something less visible at first, but just as decisive: logistics, speed, and the relentless ability of the Americans to keep moving forward without pause. For years, German strategy had relied on mobility and timing. Early victories in the war had been built on fast, coordinated advances that overwhelmed opponents before they could respond. But now, in a striking reversal, German troops found themselves on the defensive, facing an enemy that seemed capable of sustaining momentum under almost any condition. After the landings in Normandy in June 1944, American forces began pushing inland. At first, progress was slow. The Bocage terrain, with its dense hedgerows and narrow roads, limited movement and favored German defensive tactics. Supply lines were stretched, and every advance required careful coordination. But once the breakthrough came, everything changed. Operation Cobra, launched in late July 1944, marked a turning point. After a massive aerial bombardment that devastated German positions, American armored and infantry units broke through the defensive lines and moved rapidly into open territory. What followed was not just an advance, it was a surge. German soldiers began reporting something they had rarely experienced before, an enemy that did not stop. American units pushed forward day and night, covering distances that seemed impossible under normal combat conditions. Columns of trucks, tanks, and support vehicles followed closely behind the front lines, bringing fuel, ammunition, food, and reinforcements with remarkable efficiency. For the German defenders, this created a constant and exhausting pressure. There was little time to regroup, reorganize, or establish new defensive positions. A line that was held in the morning could be bypassed or overrun by evening. One of the key reasons for this relentless advance was the American logistical system. Supplies were not just delivered, they were organized, prioritized, and moved forward with precision. The famous Red Ball Express, a massive convoy system of trucks, operated almost continuously to keep frontline units supplied. Day and night, vehicles moved along designated routes, ensuring that advancing forces rarely ran out of what they needed. German soldiers, by contrast, were increasingly struggling with shortages. Fuel was limited, ammunition had to be conserved, and reinforcements were often delayed or insufficient. Vehicles broke down without replacement, and units were forced to retreat not because they were defeated in battle, but because they could no longer sustain their position. This imbalance created a growing sense of inevitability. Even when German units managed to mount effective resistance, they often found themselves outpaced. American forces could shift their focus quickly, redirecting resources to exploit weak points. If a road was blocked, another route was used. If resistance was strong in one area, pressure was applied elsewhere. Speed became a weapon. In France, during the rapid advance following the Normandy breakout, entire German formations were cut off or forced into retreat simply because they could not move fast enough to keep up with the changing front lines. Communication broke down. Orders arrived too late. Positions that were meant to be held became irrelevant as American units bypassed them entirely. For the individual German soldier, this created a disorienting experience. The front line was no longer a stable concept. It shifted constantly, sometimes within hours. A unit could go from being in reserve to being on the front line without warning, or find itself surrounded before it even realized the situation had changed. There was also the psychological toll of continuous pressure. In earlier phases of the war, battles often followed a rhythm, periods of intense combat, followed by moments of relative calm. But against the Americans, especially during the later stages of the war, those pauses became rare. Artillery fire could begin at any time. Air attacks were frequent. Ground assaults followed quickly after bombardments. And even when direct combat stopped, the sound of engines, movement, and distant explosions made it clear that the enemy was still advancing. German soldiers described this as a kind of war without pause. There was no clear moment to recover, no safe distance from the front. The pressure was constant, and over time, it wore down even experienced troops. Attempts to slow the American advance often came at a high cost. Defensive lines had to be established quickly, sometimes with limited resources and incomplete units. Counterattacks were launched under difficult conditions, often without sufficient support. And even when these efforts succeeded temporarily, the Americans returned with renewed force. By late 1944, it had become clear to many German soldiers that they were facing not just an army, but a system, one that combined industrial strength, efficient logistics, and operational speed into a continuous and overwhelming force. The Americans did not simply win battles, they maintained pressure between battles, turning every retreat into a pursuit, every delay into an opportunity to advance further.
And for those on the receiving end, this created a feeling that the war itself was accelerating, that events were moving faster than they could react, faster than they could adapt. In this environment, endurance became just as important as skill. And as the pressure continued to build, many German soldiers began to realize that the greatest danger was not a single attack, but the fact that the attacks never truly stopped.
When the war in Europe finally came to an end in May 1945, the battlefield fell silent, but the reflections of those who had fought did not. In the years that followed, former German soldiers and officers began to speak, write, and record their experiences. Among the many topics they revisited was the question of their enemies, how they fought, how they changed, and which of them had proven the most dangerous. At the beginning of the war, German forces had developed a clear respect for the British Army. They saw them as professional, disciplined, and consistent. British tactics were often methodical, sometimes cautious, but rarely surprising. This made them formidable, but also, to an extent, predictable. The Americans, on the other hand, had entered the war later, and early impressions had not been particularly strong. Many German veterans remembered their first encounters with American troops as uneven. There were mistakes, miscommunications, and moments where inexperience showed clearly. But when German soldiers looked back after the war, their tone often changed. What stood out most was not how the Americans began, but how quickly they improved. Within a relatively short time, they had transformed from inexperienced newcomers into a highly effective fighting force. German officers who had fought in North Africa, Italy, and Western Europe noted that American units adapted faster than expected. Lessons learned in one battle were applied in the next, often with noticeable results. There was also a growing acknowledgement of the American approach to warfare. It was different from traditional European methods. Instead of relying solely on precision and maneuver, the Americans combined aggression, flexibility, and overwhelming support. This created a style of combat that was difficult to counter using conventional tactics. Some German accounts describe a sense of frustration when facing American forces, not because the Americans were flawless, but because they could recover quickly from setbacks. A failed attack did not mean the end of the effort. Instead, it was often followed by another attempt, supported by even greater resources. There was also acknowledgement of the role played by American industry and logistics. German soldiers understood that they were facing not just an army, but the full capacity of a nation capable of producing vast amounts of equipment, ammunition, and supplies. This gave the Americans a level of endurance that was hard to match. Yet, alongside this recognition, there were also misconceptions. Some post-war narratives, especially in memoirs, suggested that American forces relied too heavily on firepower and lacked tactical sophistication. These views often reflected personal experiences or biases rather than the full reality of the battlefield. While it was true that the Americans made extensive use of artillery and air support, they also demonstrated effective coordination, adaptability, and initiative at multiple levels. In fact, many German officers admitted that underestimating the Americans had been a mistake. Over time, respect replaced earlier skepticism. German veterans spoke of American soldiers who fought with determination, who advanced under difficult conditions, and who did not easily give up ground once it was taken. They described an enemy that could be unpredictable in close combat and overwhelming in large-scale operations. There were also reflections on morale. American troops, despite being far from home, maintained a strong sense of purpose. They were well supplied, well supported, and generally confident in their ability to succeed. This confidence, combined with their resources, made them resilient even in challenging situations. For German soldiers who had faced them, this left a lasting impression. In conversations and writings after the war, a pattern began to emerge. While the British were respected for their professionalism and discipline, the Americans were increasingly recognized for their combination of strength, adaptability, and relentless pressure.
Fear, in this context, did not come from a single quality. It came from the way these elements worked together. An American attack could begin with overwhelming firepower, continue with aggressive infantry action, and be sustained by a logistical system that ensured it did not stop. Even if the initial assault failed, another would follow, and then another. This persistence changed how German soldiers understood the nature of their enemy. Looking back, many of them concluded that the Americans had become more dangerous over time, not because they started that way, but because they evolved into it. They learned, adapted, and improved at a pace that was difficult to match in the conditions of total war. In the end, the reflections of German veterans were not just about comparison, they were about recognition. Recognition that the Americans had brought a new kind of warfare to the battlefield, one that combined industrial power, tactical flexibility, and individual initiative into a force that was both unpredictable and relentless. And for those who had faced it, that combination they would not forget.